Welcome to Syntax. Today we've got an episode for you today on mostly web components. And I think we're going to title this one, Web Components Can't Save Us, because we've got Scott Jehl on. He has a pretty good background in JavaScript and web development in general. I'll let him talk a little bit about that, but I've known him for, I don't know, probably feels like 13, 14 years.
Wow.
I remember taking a bus to jQuery conference together many years ago, and it's kind of fun to be able to, this often happens that we get to come back and talk to people that you've known for so long. So welcome, Scott. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks, Wes. It's really nice to be here. I listen to the show all the time. So and
right
good
on.
to see you, Scott.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, two Scotts. I don't think we've ever had two Scotts on, have we?
I don't know.
Yeah.
This very well may be a first. We've never had another Wes
Certainly.
on it.
Really?
Yeah.
You want to give people just a quick rundown of your background? Because
Sure.
I know from way back when you were pretty early in the responsive design scene, and then you've had several jobs since then.
Yeah. That's right. I guess I could start from way back and go towards now. So back when I knew you, I guess I was working at Filament Group, an agency in Boston. They're still around, kicking ass. And I was there for 15 years, and we had some long term for our industry. But it was great. You know, we had just an array of amazing clients throughout that time. We got to build the Boston Globe's first responsive, large scale website that sort of made a name for us in doing responsive work. We did the Lego Shops front end. We worked for Vineyard Vines for a long time. And, a lot of that client work drove some of our open source work, like for the jQuery team. So I met you through that. And yeah, I was on that team since we were putting together the website in John Resig's bedroom. So it goes way back.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so Filament for a long time, a lot of open source and web standards work came out of that, and performance audits and things like that. So I ended up doing a lot of performance work to the point that, at some point, Catchpoint, the company, had acquired Webpage Test, the product, and free webpagetest.org performance testing tool. And I had long been sort of a super fan of the tool and an advocate and a community member, and they were staffing up the team, and it felt like, sort of the right moment to make the jump to work on a product for a little bit. So I got to do that Catchpoint for a couple of years, and we built the first commercial addition to the product that they had, which was called Webpage Test Pro, and it was pretty fun. It let you apply optimizations to websites live over the air using workers and sort of a reverse proxy sort of thing, and actually see
cool.
if optimizations, move the needle without having to do all the code to see that.
Yeah.
And so that was pretty neat. After that, took a little time freelancing, worked with the folks at Begin, and they do enhanced.dev, the web components framework. So that was great just to get some exposure to how people are building on these things right now that are just starting to make their way into, some of the biggest companies in the world are adopting them now. So so that was great for exposure. And then and now I'm at Squarespace. I've been there for 3 months now, pretty much.
Right
and it's fantastic. I mean, it's the first time that I've sort of been in a role where performance changes that I could make could potentially, end up rippling out to millions of websites as opposed to working on one client at a time. So the scale is pretty inspiring to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wild. I often talk to people, I don't want to name a competitor, but I've talked to some of the folks at Wix as well, and it's just a scale that these things are running at. Just a couple bytes here and there could mean serious bandwidth savage over the scale.
Yeah.
Savage.
And also, for those people who weren't around in 2011, that Boston Globe site was, you hinted at that. That was kind of monumental. In fact, the agency that I worked at used the Boston Globe site every single time we were trying to sell responsive design on our clients in 2011. It was like no one knew what it was. And so you had to show everybody, yes, this is going to take a big more effort, but look at the experience you can get. And this is how good it can be. So, man, that thing was huge.
That's a great story. Credit to their team for taking, I think, a pretty big risk at the time and adopting technology that was just like right at the right moment to jump on it. And also just, the team that was involved, Ethan Marcotte worked with us in-house at Filament Group, the team at Filament, Upstatement did all the design work. They're just a fabulous design shop. So it was kind of a dream project. I don't know if we'll ever, quite live up to that one again.
Because it was like early days of
it was very
mobile
early.
devices, right? Like we had those big mobile device walls where you would test on every single device, and it's true. I don't know that we'll ever have that big of a shift in how we consume media.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Maybe VR, but I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Filament had a physical device lab. I remember Matt Marquis was, or Marquis, I think it was, restarting all these devices every morning and keeping them on and charged. And we didn't really have browser stack and things like that quite as commonly then. I think they were around, but that was wild times.
I had a device lab too. I made my own out of wood and had all the USB hubs powering. I just went to my family, give me all your old phones, please. Let me just put them on a big wall here. And I forget who it was. Somebody made software that kept them all in sync a little ways into there when the device lab was still such a...
browser... What was it called?
Brendan, browser sync?
Not Browserify, not Browser Stack. There was I still have it in one of my courses. Browser something.
Yeah.
It basically,
sure.
it synced all the clicks across and all the scrolls. And I don't know.
Yeah.
That was pretty cool. I look back very fondly at those years.
Really fun time to be
everything
working on
went
the
down.
web. Yeah, totally.
So web components. Web components are a thing in JavaScript, HTML, where you can essentially make your own components, right? And there's a lot, especially lately on the Twitter sphere, there's been a couple of big framework authors come out and say web components is not it, and lots of people coming out saying web components is it. Scott and I talked to a lot of the people from Shoelace or the Web Awesome folks.
Yeah, right.
I'm pretty bullish on them as well. I'm curious to your thoughts on them, and obviously you have a course on them as well, so I'm assuming you like them.
Yeah, well, partly I wanted to do this course to learn them more deeply, especially just how different companies were using them and their design systems, because, a lot of them, big companies have adopted them. Adobe has Spectrum, and Microsoft recently built the whole Chrome of their Edge browser, rebuilt it in web components, and reported really, big performance gains from doing that. So I wanted, for my own sake, to understand it a little bit more deeply, and what better way than create a course. Yeah, so I'm a big fan. I feel like I've followed some, not all, of the drama that framework authors have been writing about recently. And, I feel like a lot of people frame web components in sort of a light that, brings expectations that they are similar to components, as sort of like the metaphor comes from React and in other worlds. And I think they're not necessarily the same thing, right? They're not necessarily built as a replacement one-to-one for a lot of the concepts that you would, have in your mind from frameworks about what a component really is. Even very much just the fact that, they're built on HTML elements, like custom elements that don't go away when you include them into your document structure, much like, maybe like an import sort of mindset works when you're dealing with components in other frameworks and languages. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like they have good points. It's sort of an interesting time to figure out how to use these things. And I like parts of them more than others, or at least a lot more use out of some parts than others.
So what are web components good at? Where should people that are listening, why should they care about what a web component is?
Well, I feel like they're really good at the sort of the leaf node portion of an app, where you have your button or the actual little user interaction component part that might live within a broader framework, or some sort of app orchestrating all of these, or they could stand alone on their own. And that's sort of I think the killer feature of them is that we now have somewhat of a built-in model in the browser that can allow these things to stand alone and live in many places, and be compatible in a whatever kind of single page app if you need them to be. But ultimately they're HTML, right? So anywhere you're emitting HTML elements, you could potentially be emitting a web component there instead, and maybe it carries its own, sort of internal logic and behavior. And so I think, that to me is a nice, sort of transitional way to think about how they could start to be part of, existing code bases today. And the way I've used them most, in my own experience is as sort of little, progressive enhancement little patterns. Like, you wrap a custom element around some markup that already does something, but maybe not the whole thing that you want it to do. And then you've got this beautiful life cycle that, oh, this thing just appeared in the DOM. Well, let's apply some behavior to it. Things that just weren't quite so elegant in the jQuery days when we were waiting for the whole DOM to be there.
I saw a really neat one the other day. I think it was from someone who works on Lit, and they made a number formatter HTML component, which essentially is, instead of wrapping, let's say, for example, this project has 428,482 downloads, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, or I've earned $1,300, you have to put the $sign in front of it. You have to put the commas in the right spot, right? And usually when you do that, you have to use the intl number format APIs, and you sort of break the flow of HTML.
Yeah.
You say, okay, now let me go over to JavaScript, select the thing, format it, and then stick it back into the DOM, right?
Right.
And especially if you're not using like a framework, that's kind of annoying. So they just made a little web component that you pass the value as the body of the tag.
Sure.
And then that thing is all nicely packed, and when the component loads, it will take its body and parse it out and format it and then return it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of just a beautiful way to keep the declarative nature of HTML without having to do a whole bunch of JavaScript every single time you want it.
Yeah, that sounds like a beautiful pattern. And, just like you said, it starts with something that's already usable and makes it a little better.
Yes.
If the script happened to fail to load or had an error or whatever happens.
Still a number.
That reminds me of GitHub has lots of these little patterns throughout its UI, like the little timestamps that say how many minutes ago a commit happened uses their relative time custom element. And if you look in there, it's got the timestamp, kind of spelled out in full. And then in the shadow DOM of that same component, they've got the version of it that you see, which is, 3 hours ago or whatever it is. It's pretty neat, I think. You nailed it. That's the pattern that I think they're best at.
I didn't even realize that GitHub was using web components too. I think that's the other thing about web components is no one necessarily knows. If you're not in the world, you don't think to look for it unless you're inspecting element on every little thing.
Yeah, they're all over GitHub's UI. I've used a lot of their examples because they've published a lot of those too, open source, and they're really good.
So when you're consuming personally web components, do you find yourself always reaching to write them from scratch, or are there particular things that you would go to third parties or looking, whether that is stuff like Shoelace or stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, a library like that fits the same use case that a lot of, design system sort of libraries have fit for us for a long time. They're just using more modern APIs that are built into the browser, and they have, in their case, a very polished experience too. I think they've done just really beautiful work. So yeah, I mean, if that was the sort of thing that I was looking for, someone like WebAwesome looks pretty attractive. I also feel like a lot of our peers are just sharing great examples all the time. Zach Leatherman, Dave Rupert, they keep these lists of good examples, whether they often built them themselves or are referencing others out there. So yeah, I feel like there's just a lot of very good examples. Jeremy Keith is another, just posting good examples a lot. All in this sort of HTML web components sort of pattern, like Wes was just talking about. Got something, make it a little better.
Yeah, totally.
What about reactivity? Because that's one thing that we don't have APIs for in the browser, at least not yet. I'm really hoping at some point we'll have the ability to just put a variable in a div, and that variable will update itself if it does. If you do need reactivity, what are you reaching for?
I mean, currently, I feel like there are very good small libraries that can give you that tool set. I mentioned enhance.dev. They have some nice base libraries or base classes rather that build on web components and offer that reactivity. There's WebC that works with static generated sites and 11D sites. And then Lit, you mentioned Lit. That one's sort of like a power tool, I think, for more like, like the real-time UI React sort of use case. So those are there. On the standards front, like you talk about things like signals a lot on your show. I feel like that's within the web components community. It's signals and DOM parts, right? That are like going to be the two standards that potentially figure out this problem. And those aren't necessarily like part of web components, like 3 tiers or whatever. But it's like, these are all standalone, standards that can work independently or together.
What is DOM parts? I've not heard of this.
Yeah, so that's, we'll have to link that up, but there's, so the Web Components community group has a GitHub page with lots of proposals, and I think that one's been discussed for at least a year, maybe more now. It's just, framework authors like the leads from Lit have come together with ideas on how to build in markers into the DOM for being able to, make updates a little more smoothly, I guess, especially if the HTML comes from the server and you want to update it with the rehydration kind of thing. I think their explainer is pretty long, and it's been a little while since I've looked at it, but I know that's, as of even today, I was talking with someone over at their group about that still being sort of where you'd point someone for that.
Neat. Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is what I was hoping for. This is
it looks
variables
great, right?
In HTML. There's a declarative API and an imperative API. You put variables in things, and then when those variables updates, it will render.
Yeah, it's what we've wanted for a while, yes. Right? Something like that. Yeah, and something, frankly, that the HTML template element just hasn't really given us, right? Like you have to do the sort of surgical updates on the DOM nodes with the template, and that's fine, but it's not what people coming from frameworks are used to.
Yeah,
that's exciting.
It also, I mean, it's not directly related, but have you seen the invokers stuff?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's kind of I wonder if invokers ends up becoming something more useful with web components for people who don't know. It's basically like declarative event, or like you're triggering events in HTML.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That would be, I feel like that would be a really interesting way to interact with web components right now that we don't have.
Totally. Yeah. And we're seeing just so much more of that. Like popover is sort of like a similar parallel, where just a lot of wiring is happening in HTML instead of needing to reach out to write script. So it's pretty exciting.
Let's talk about styling in web components world. Because
how long is this podcast?
we go for about an hour, but that's also often a pain point in the web component world. Is web components are entirely encapsulated, meaning that if you want to be able to style something inside of the web component, there's this thing called the shadow DOM, right? And your styles don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but your styles don't inherit, and they don't go, you can't select things from the parent to the child unless you explicitly surface like variables that can be passed in. Is that right?
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, for the most part, styles in the, should we say, parent page don't make their way into a shadow root, but some do. So like inheritable classes, styles, like, a font color, things like that are going to roll right through if they apply from a parent of the custom element right into the shadow DOM. So that's surprising to a lot of people who think it's totally, encapsulated from the start. And even JavaScript is sort of optionally encapsulated, right? So like you can have a closed shadow root, which is for most purposes inaccessible for JavaScript to get to from, like, say, querying the DOM. But if you set the mode to open, then the parent of the shadow root gains a shadow root property that you can then query deeper into the shadow DOM. So you kind of like, you can't accidentally get into the shadow root with JavaScript, but you can make it so people can optionally get into it. CSS, open and close doesn't matter. That doesn't really affect it. It's a JavaScript concept, but it's complicated, right? Like you mentioned, you can put styles inside the shadow DOM. You could put a link element in there and reference an external style sheet, reuse it across your page in many shadow DOMs. That works great now. So that's like a good pattern, I think.
Let's stop on that for a sec,
Yeah.
because I think that's a pretty nifty or interesting way is you can literally just link your CSS sheet in every single component.
Yep.
And even if it's linked in the parent, it's not going to re-download the CSS
Right.
3,000 times.
Thankfully, that's
just
fixed now.
activate.
It used to.
So one of the options of if somebody has an existing CSS and they're like, I just want my website's styles to apply to my web component, they can simply just link up the same style sheet and then all of those styles will be available.
You might want to be a little more careful about the global styles just being pulled into a web component and how that affects it. But you could certainly imagine like a component-based style sheet that's used every time your menu component is used throughout the page or something like that. But for the most part, styles within the shadow DOM, whether they're in a style element in inline or in a external link like that, are pretty well encapsulated. There are ways to reach out. Like you've probably talked about the :host selector where you can talk to the custom element parent. So there's like a little bit of reaching out, I guess, of the shadow DOM that you can do there. But for the most part, within the DOM, it's protected. But the outer page, there's a lot of exceptions that can get in. CSS custom properties famously can breach the shadow DOM, and it's kind of like the killer feature for allowing customization. That works just like in external SVG files too. Like it's kind of similar with the shadow DOM. Those custom properties pass through, and you can offer up configuration like that.
And if you want to see all of the errors in your application, you'll want to check out Sentry at sentry.io/syntax. You don't want a production application out there that, well, you have no visibility into in case something is blowing up and you might not even know it. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax. Again, we've been using this tool for a long time and it totally rules. All right. Is that how you're often seeing people offer? Like,
yeah.
Sometimes I wonder, like, if I hit sometimes a web component, it feels like they've just like re-implemented CSS and cut like a billion custom properties to let you get control over it.
You're right.
But dash font family.
Yeah.
Totally.
Is that the best way? Yeah.
I mean,
build like an
I think it's
interface
a good way. Like, for example, we mentioned like types of patterns that you'd use custom web components for. And another is like for the third-party embed sort of situation. The Apple Pay button uses web components in this way where it's just attributes. There's no content inside the Apple Pay element. And then they control everything about it from an external script, right? But they do offer customization through CSS custom properties. So you can like override certain parts, but not like, changing the Apple logo shape or something like that, right? So I think that's like a smart use of Shadow DOM in particular, where, maybe you have a video player that goes on like Vimeo or YouTube or something like that and embeds everywhere. Maybe that's a good use case where you really need tight fidelity over a UI. Don't want it conflicting with page styles.
Yeah, we would often just use an iframe for that.
Exactly. Yeah,
so that there's nothing available, right? Maybe you don't need that.
Yeah, so this would allow you to at least piecemeal offer some configuration in the layout or whatever you want to use custom properties to do. One pattern that I didn't mention that I think is kind of an interesting one, and I haven't seen done a lot yet, is they're really good for polyfills. Like, for example, short preface here. So last fall, I did some work to help land responsive video back in Firefox. It had been taken away from us for a while in the standards and in the browser support.
Can you explain, before we even get into the web components, you sent me a note about that, and I was like, responsive video?
Yeah.
I don't know I know what that is. Can you explain that?
That's fair, because I kind of made up the word. Yeah, so, if you think about responsive images, you have the picture element.
Yeah.
This is very much a parallel in with the video element. So when HTML5 first landed in web standards, we had the video element spec, which included media queries on source elements in the video element. So that was supported from the start. You could put on each of your sources inside a video, you could put at media, min width 500 pixels or whatever for one source, and then another that it would fall back to in the same order that a picture element works, right? So like the first one that matches is used by the browser. So that worked originally. It was cross-browser when it was, I don't know, like 2014, I guess, when we were starting to work on speccing the responsive images, syntax that would ultimately land in the browsers. And Picture was designed based on this cool aspect that worked in the video element. So we were like, the video works this way. We should really, Picture should have media queries like that, right? For art direction. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's proven to be, I think pretty successful. Like there's no better tool that I would use to have different aspect ratios of an image across different viewport sizes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that was what we used for inspiration. Meanwhile, some folks on the standards bodies didn't feel that was a good model to base Picture on. And throughout that conversation, they actually decided to just remove the feature from video and from the standard. So it was pulled from the HTML5 living standard for video, and all the while it was landing the same feature in Picture.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So as a result, once the spec was changed, Chrome pulled their support, Firefox pulled their support, and we actually were left without support except in Safari. So this has always worked in Safari. Anyway, so I kind of made like an annoying campaign for like however many years that we really shouldn't have deleted this feature. And finally, browser vendors started to chime in last fall and say, yeah, we agree. We're interested. We want to build this back in. I just had to quickly learn some C# and get this landed back in Firefox. The Chrome team got their support back in overnight. It was kind of embarrassing.
Man.
How long it took me. And yeah, and the standards was updated. So we have that back in browsers now. So if you want to serve...
we have source set on video.
Not source set, sorry.
Source set.
Just media attributes on source elements. So like...
okay. You could write a media query?
Yeah, exactly. So like...
Okay.
A lot of more and more video is streaming now. But say you had a blog post and you've got a local video file and you just don't want to serve the massive one to a phone, you could use this to serve responsibly.
Yeah, or even like different aspect ratios. Because whenever I do a TikTok video, I'll edit it in portrait, and then I'll make a second cut of it in square, and I just post them to different platforms, assuming most people on Twitter are going to be on their desktop. TikTok, they're going to be on their phone, so they get the different one. But wouldn't it be nice if I could upload both versions of that and it just showed the person based on the screen they're on? Yeah,
so that's it. And this could totally pair with streaming video too. You would just have a couple of different, media queries and sources. So that was the preface to say the polyfill use case. So the one weird thing about responsive video is, unlike Picture, it only works once. So like you visit the page and whatever the viewport happens to be, it'll choose a source and it sticks with it. So if you resize the browser, it doesn't switch sources, right? And we decided to do that to get the feature back just because that's how Safari's implementation worked right now. So we wanted to match that, but it's still sort of like an open issue. So yeah, I wrote a polyfill recently that just wraps a custom element around a video element and adds that behavior. You have to sync the time code if you're switching sources on resize, but it's relatively like it's a small piece of JavaScript. It's not doing a whole lot, but it just gives you that, that fully responsive feeling after load. And the cool thing about it, I think, is you can write, custom elements.define in your web component. That's how you like teach the browser about an element. You could just do that based on a feature detect. So if the browser understands or passes this test for responsive video after page load, then don't define this element at all. Like we're just, fail silently. I think that's a cool use case for polyfills. I'd like to see more of it. But, So that's another one. It's kind of in the weeds.
Totally.
But
no, I like it. talk a lot about Mux's implementation of their video player in web components. So they need a video player that is both highly customizable. You need to be able to change literally any part of it, but also it needs to work across all the different frameworks and in just straight up HTML. So Mux has this amazing player. They have a dedicated website for it. What is it?
MediaChrome. But most importantly, Wes, is that it supports streaming and all the HLS and all that stuff out of the box. So you can use essentially a video element and pass in a M3AU and have it work like a HTML video element.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it just tucks all the complexity into a element, and then like you, the user, don't have to do a whole bunch of JavaScript where you initialize the video player and all that. You simply just use the different web components, and then you get things like the play button or the seek bar or the thumbnail. It's a pretty nifty implementation.
I'm curious about what are the things that you would change about web components today that maybe is on the radar or not on the radar at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'd like to change that people say web components instead of custom elements most of the time. But that ship has sailed. I think there are complexities with working with the Shadow DOM that I find unfortunate. It would be really nice to be able to openly style Shadow DOM if you want to. And that's not really an option, like from the parent page, just being able to select right in. Maybe there's some, pseudo selector, special parent selector to dig into a shadow root. That would be really neat.
Yeah, totally.
Shadow DOM itself introduces a lot of more complicated scenarios, like forms suddenly become complicated. It's not that you can't work around these problems, but it's like you're really buying into a more, a deeper situation. Like if you have a form element, like an input, and it's in the Shadow DOM, it's not going to submit with your form unless you teach the browser about it, right? That's surprising. I didn't know that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I could see that could be a pain.
Yeah, and there are APIs for this stuff that come with the web component specs. So it's totally workaroundable. Another one's accessibility, like simple things that you would expect to work, like a label and an input being able to pair through a for attribute and an ID. They don't know about each other if they have to cross a shadow root. So accessibility is broken if you don't properly pair them. And you can. Again, there's APIs to fix these things that are standard, not just like, weird workarounds. But you have to know about these things, I think, when you adopt Shadow DOM. So I think some of those, it would be nice if the problems weren't there in the first place to catch people.
Yeah, those paper cuts, especially if somebody's like, all right, I'm going to try it. And then they're like, oh, this is odd. It doesn't work like they would expect it right off the bat. Those are the types of things that can give people a bad taste in their mouth.
Yeah.
But what is the process for exposing, like you want to make a custom input? Because that's a huge use case, is a date picker web component.
Right.
How beautiful would it be if we don't have to put all this junk on our page and just have a beautiful date picker input? How do you expose that to the parent form then?
Yeah, so form associated is like a static property that you set to true, and that is sort of the starting point to say that you have, say, like a custom checkbox or something like that, and it needs to be like carrying a value with the form, and that value is going to be on the custom element itself rather than like something deep in its Shadow DOM.
Yeah.
So just that concept alone, I mean, to me was, surprising. So it's that form associated, like read the docs on MDN about that, combined with element internals, which is a whole series of properties and methods that help you, connect elements for accessibility purposes and for form submission.
Oh yeah, validity and
totally,
max and min, and if you want to be, because sometimes you don't want to pass those things down, right? And then sometimes you do.
Right, and the validity thing is pretty interesting because that lets you tie into the real CSS selectors for like valid, invalid, things like that. The thing about web components and custom elements is you're really building HTML elements, and I feel like you really feel that when you get into the Shadow DOM parts of it, because there's just so much to make sure is wired up properly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember inspecting element on a video player, or like I think back in the day on Firefox, if you open a video straight up in a tab, then you can inspect element and you realize, oh, the video player itself is just a whole bunch of HTML. These are just buttons and event listeners and whatnot, but they've, again, abstracted that away into its own component.
Totally, yeah. The one that I kind of get a kick out of is the HTML input elements. Like if you dig into them, they use Shadow DOM, and then you look inside and it's just a div.
Yeah.
And even like the number input, like input type of number, even the little buttons in there, just divs.
Just div.
Yeah.
Didn't even use buttons?
No.
No.
No. At least not in Chrome's implementation. But yeah. That varies across browsers. So
yeah. Wow, that's cool. And I wanted to ask about design systems, because one of the most popular episodes we've ever done on this show was with Brad Frost talking about design systems. Yeah. And the question people always have about design systems is, how do I make it work across all of these different things? We got 4 Vue, 3 Angular, 7 React teams inside of our organization. How do I make this look consistent across them? And his answer was, we build them out in web components.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've done any of that or have any thoughts on it.
I'm like at Squarespace, I'm on the performance team, so I'm not necessarily building design systems day to day, but I've certainly had a lot of experience in the past doing that. I saw Brad last week, and he was talking about how they've sort of standardized on web components as the leaf node, or, the small unit that you would build in a design system and then combine them together. And I think they're a great fit for that. I mean, there's, really good compatibility with frameworks now. You could speak to this a little better than I could. I'm not sure where React is with the latest 19 release or whatever, but they fixed a lot to be able to work with web components. A lot of companies are finding like this makes a lot of sense. Build the little units using these. IBM is one just in the past few weeks that wrote about how they brought their web component portion of their design system into the main repo and sort of endorsed it as the way forward, from what I could tell from the outside anyway. So
that's cool.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, have them sort of isolated and handling their own behavior, and still being able to emit events and receive configuration through attributes.
I like that a lot, especially you mentioned React, because React now and React 19 works well with web components, and you can use the like reactivity and just pass your state variables to a web component, and the web component will update itself.
Totally.
Which is really cool. So like if you are working somewhere where you think, okay, I need to make this semi-complex thing, but I don't want to build it in React because it also has to work in Angular or whatever. Mm-hmm. It might be worth building it in a web component, especially like if it's kind of complex. You don't feel like you're doing lots of DOM stuff. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it might even be easier to write it in vanilla JavaScript than to have to deal with all the refs headaches that you get with React.
And there's some at least small degree of reactivity that you can get through web components APIs. Like there's the attribute change callback, so you can sort of build on top of that to update, make your own DOM updates internally, and maybe not rely on the outer framework to do that part. But the tools are there. I think it makes a lot of sense more and more, especially as at some point, the framework of choice will change, in the future. And these are built on standards. They're not going away, right? So totally. They can go into the next, next framework build. So exciting that they're finally starting to work.
Totally. That's the beauty of standards. I think like I've been watching web components for a long time, and I've sort of changed from like, I don't understand it to why is it not more popular? Yeah. And now you're starting to see a bit more momentum to it. And I think if we land signals in the browser as like a way to do, in the DOM parts you said, as a way to do reactive UI, like that's a major part, especially if the performance of it is potentially better than like what a virtual DOM would be, because the browser is doing it, not necessarily just in JavaScript.
Yeah.
So we'll
Yeah.
see.
I'm excited about that part because, now, like, a lot of my work is in performance, right? And like for the last decade, we've been pretty focused on there is a lot of JavaScript in the way of rendering, right? Like we're generating too much content after delivery. And finally, frameworks and everyone are starting to agree like that was a mistake. We're delivering HTML popularly, right? And so the new sort of JavaScript centric problem becomes that HTML that's being delivered, that's great, is now being chased by 2 to 10 megabytes of JavaScript for rehydration. And what happens is you see a very different experience across devices in how they handle that, parsing that massive payload when it lands. The average, Android device off the shelf these days is like 5 times slower than the nicest iPhone that we can buy. And I'm seeing UIs that, are delayed by 10 seconds for interactivity.
Really?
After it looks ready to use, but it's not it's not able to, you're not able to interact with it for that long. And that's just with like 2 megabytes of JavaScript. That's transfer size. I mean, that's a lot, but we're seeing a lot more than that too.
Yeah.
Like very popular sites we all use every day. So I feel like that's the new problem, like we got it out of the rendering path, but it's still there. And maybe these APIs are going to help us start to slim that down a little bit,
Yeah. How are people really using web components though in their full site builds today? Like, are you finding them that they're building them into component or framework-based sites? Because I think one of the big things that a lot of people, they see their framework-based sites, and now you get page changes without full page reloads, history API, all that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But in web components, right, without a framework behind it, you're still getting full page reloads. You're still getting these things. How are people building like sites today?
Well, I think like you could look to GitHub as an example of a really complicated sort of app that is using web components and also quite a bit of, I think, React. And maybe more so they're moving back towards React. But it's certainly there orchestrating lots of little web components throughout the page. So, that's one popular way that we're seeing them used. I think a lot of ordinary websites are getting by without any, single page app orchestration of their web components too, right? Like ideally, a lot of websites are using these in the same ways that we would have used any progressive enhancement sort of scripting in the past, which I hope, with better and better tools that are letting us deliver HTML from the server, that'll more and more become popular again, right? Because it is how browsers are designed to receive a website, right? Like they've got the preload scanner, they get this HTML, and they're already busy like finding image references to go fetch and things like that. And anytime there's something in the way of generating that HTML so soon, it's, that's a performance bottleneck. So
would you say that you're like a fan of the React server component approach, where you simply just do it all on the server by default and then sort of opt in, make islands as you need interactivity, rather than the whole just rehydrate the whole website?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
big fan.
Especially, just conceptually, like it's so good to see the React community coming around to this idea. But also many other frameworks are thinking similarly. And, I mentioned like enhanced.dev. They have this great concept of, being able to compose large scale apps using custom elements on the server side. And you sort of like, each file is a custom element that might have some scripting or whatever associated, but you're composing with them, and ultimately you get a flat HTML file at the end. I think in a lot of ways that's similar, where the client side scripting is something you opt into, right? And yeah, I'm thrilled to see that with React sites. And I think like we could totally see a world where we're using web components to take the handoff from React server components and extend them when you need to, right? It wouldn't necessarily have to be React on the client. It could be custom elements.
we have Brian on all the time because we
Yeah.
love to hear his opinions on
He's great.
things. He's one of these people that's like very opinionated, but not in like a jerky way. Like I appreciate his opinions, even if I don't necessarily agree with them. I always like to hear what he has to say.
Yeah.
Totally.
And in one of his opinions is that you don't need a build tool. You just ship ESM straight to the browser. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, especially around like performance and waterfalls.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, this is stepping a little outside of like my day-to-day expertise.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd want to speak to it. I do think it's really interesting. And gosh, like when I was working on web page tests, that is a PHP app, and I would hit save and hit refresh and it was ready. And like the speed at which we could move, building new features was amazing. So I did not miss a build process there. But of course there's some benefits to it. I feel like it just, varies by your needs. Like I think if you could have a mindset of not defaulting to like, all right, let's set up Webpack. I'm making a blog, like that sort of mindset, and sort of like getting instead to a point where you're like, okay, this has reached a level of complexity where we need a build. That's a healthier way to approach it. They're certainly popular. People are using them for different reasons, but I do like the idea of, trying to write code that's actually the code that you're running in the browser more and more. It's really nice.
DHH, the guy who created Rails, kind of said this the other week as well, is like they don't run a build tool or anything. They just ship ESM right to the browser, and it works great. And obviously there's probably some downsides there, but because they're doing most things server side, they don't need a ton of JavaScript on there. And you can literally go to Hey and whatever and view source on their JavaScript, see all the comments, and it feels like the old web, which I very much appreciate.
Yeah, I miss a lot of that. But a lot of the new web is kind of coming around to feel like the old web, like a lot of these new standards just feel in that same spirit to me. So it's a fun time.
Especially all the new CSS stuff as well. I'm sure you're happy about taking all that stuff off the main thread. All the new CSS, like rendering the scroll animations, things like that.
It's incredible. Yeah, view transitions that, I mean, a lot of people adopt single page apps to get transitions, right? Like that's the beauty of it.
Right.
So, I mean, there's so much in CSS right now. It's wild.
Cool. Well, now is the part of the show where we get into sick picks and shameless plugs. Scott, did you come prepared with a sick pick today?
I did, but I kind of telegraphed it a lot already. I'm going to say it again now. Yeah. Enhance.dev. I'm a big fan. I got to collaborate with that team a little bit over the winter. I'm no longer affiliated, but I'm still I really think they've come across some great patterns that even if it's not their toolkit that you end up using, just this idea of thinking about composing with custom elements through the whole stack is super slick. So check them out.
The showcase is really fun to go through because you can, especially you look at one like Enhance Movies, they kind of built like a Netflix style
really
site.
Well done. Yeah.
Like you think, this is it's not going to be a good experience. Or you open up DevTools and be like, they got to be bundling this. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. Look up DevTools and watch it. It's wild.
Yeah. And they have a WASM build that lets you run Enhance on basically any platform. So if you go in their docs and check that out, you can run it on Ruby, you can run it on PHP.
Oh.
That was kind of a game changer. And they were just releasing that as I was finishing up.
I don't think I saw this.
There. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
The benefit there would be you can do all your templating, create all your custom elements, and still server render even if you're using PHP. Like it doesn't have to be a node environment, right?
Yeah, and if you go to the GitHub repos for each sort of flavor of it, it's pretty concise. And it's cool to see spaghetti-ish PHP and then, there's a custom element. Yeah.
That's cool. I didn't realize they had done that. WASM is so cool, man.
It is
unreal. You can just bundle. Talk about bundling things up, sticking it in a nice package. WASM is the custom element of the server.
Yeah. So check them out.
Sweet.
High praise. Talented team.
And shameless plug. You can plug as many things as you like.
Yeah, well, we're hiring at Squarespace on the accessibility and performance teams. So I would advise checking those out. A couple of senior engineer positions. So yeah, that's one. Also, Wes mentioned it, but I have a course. It's very new still. Web Components Demystified. It's 8 hours of talking about web components, all
Nice.
very deep. So also there's a coupon, Syntax. You can get 30% off. So
Oh, sweet.
yeah, the word syntax.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your thoughts. It's good to catch up as well as learn a little bit about. I feel like every time we have somebody on about web components, I had no idea that was a thing. I had no idea that was a
It's
thing.
moving so fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
The community group is a great resource. They have a Discord. They're always looking for feedback. There's lots of proposals that are being discussed. Any feature that you're thinking, web components don't do that. I like that part of the framework. They're probably thinking about that feature. So, yeah, definitely check it out.
That's the web component community group?
Yep.
Discord?
Yep.
Okay. I'm just making sure we don't link the wrong one up. Beautiful. Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on. I appreciate your time and have a good one.
Yeah, thank you both so much. All right. See
Thanks,
ya.
Scott.